A very good morning to all of you, dear delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I heartily welcome each of you to the second day of INFOCOM Cal 2018. Yesterday was fully packed, and I'm sure all of you enjoyed yourselves. Today, we have another packed day, and I wish you enjoy every moment of the second day of INFOCOM Cal 2018. We begin the second day of the INFOCOM 2018 conference with a spotlight session on Life 3.0. This session is brought to you by Intueri Consulting, LLP. Intueri is a broad-based strategy consulting, corporate finance advisory, and research firm working on clients across the country and world. Today, we are very privileged to have with us Mr. Ben Hammersley, futurist, author, and global digital leader, presenter of BBC and Netflix TV series, editor-at-large of UK's Wired magazine and inventor of the word podcast, who will be joining us shortly on stage. Before I invite him onto the dais, let me say a few words to introduce him. Mr. Ben Hammersley has been called one of the most thought-provoking futurists of our times and has addressed audiences around the globe for over 15 years. Over the past 20 years, he has been a technology journalist for The Times and The Guardian, a war reporter covering Afghanistan and Beirut, and author of 5 books, the presenter of a landmark BBC and Netflix television series, the editor-at-large of UK's Wired magazine, a consultant to the UK and US governments, and the European Commission, the inventor of the word podcast, and a pilot, emergency medic, rescue diver, and ultra runner. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with a huge round of applause Mr. Ben Hammersley to deliver his keynote on Life 3.0. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Good morning. Hi. Cool. Right. Thank you very much for having me. As you just heard, my name's Ben Hammersley. I have my CV is too long. Basically, what I do right now is I work as a futurist. So my job is to live in the future and then come back here and tell you all about it. And so when I was on my way here, I was talking to, and yesterday as well, and this morning, I was talking to some of the people who are organizing this conference, and to some people who'd been here before, and they said that, you know, after the, 18 years that this conference has been running? 17. I made you older. After all these years, you know, the sort of attendees are very technically skilled and very knowledgeable. And so what I wanted to do was, if I could get this to work. There we go. If we can change that slide as well as that one, that would be awesome. I'll go over here and do it. There you go. So, I sort of thought about the fact that the audience here was very sophisticated, and what I wanted to do was apply some of my sort of consultancy tools to what it was I was going to speak about. And so I asked myself, you know, what is like the most fundamental basic product question, which is, what is it that the audience wants? Now, what it is you actually want, of course, is to learn about the future, and that's fine. There are many futurists like myself who will come to a conference like this and will show you lots of pictures of new technologies. They'll show you lots of pictures of futuristic things. You'll see pictures of robots, or you'll see pictures of skyscrapers with trees growing out of the top, or pictures of electric vehicles, or something like that. And I could give you that, but I think the people here, and especially a lot of the people on the front row, for example, are far too sophisticated for that sort of offering. When I give that sort of talk, specifically in America, I call it the Victoria's Secret offering. It's basically just showing you a catalog of very pretty things. And after about an hour, you'll be very excited, but you won't really remember any of it, and you won't learn anything, and it won't be of any use to you. So instead, what I want to do is give you the tools to do my job. Basically, what I want to do is give you new ways of thinking about the future, ways to understand the future so that you can do this presentation yourself. And I think that will be much more productive at the end of the day. So, to be a futurist, the first thing you need to do is have this slide. This is the most useful slide of all slides that you could have in a PowerPoint deck to talk about technology. An exponential curve up and to the right. Every single technology talk has to have this slide. You can use it to describe anything. Internet penetration, mobile phone ownership, the number of people playing Fortnite on their iPhone. Whatever it is, it can be described with an exponential curve up and to the right. Now, the most famous of these curves is Moore's Law, named after this man. He's called Gordon Moore, and he was the co-founder of Intel. And of course, being technologists, you'll all know about Gordon Moore, because in 1964, he wrote a very famous technical paper. And in that paper, he had a graph. Because he was an engineer, it used a logarithmic scale. But this is actually the graph that he used in his paper to describe a very interesting phenomenon. What he'd found was that every year, from 1959 up until the time that he wrote the paper, every year, for the same amount of money, they could fit twice as many components onto one of their microchips. Now this, we now call Moore's Law, and the way we talk about it now is that roughly every year, for the same price, computing power doubles. That's where we get that exponential curve from, because every year, the computing power, as I say, doubles. And so we've lived through this very interesting phenomenon since the 60s, since even the 50s, actually, 1959, which in one way is a very long time. Everybody in this room has lived your entire lives, or the vast majority of your lives, in a time when the world was governed by this doubling and doubling and doubling of computer power every year, right? It's something that we all understand. It's the phenomenon where Tim Cook of Apple, for example, will stand on a stage like this in San Francisco every September and instantly make the phone in your pocket rubbish, right? So we sort of live through that phenomenon. We understand it. But human society really doesn't. The human sort of concept of how to do things, no matter where you are on the planet, the way we structure our society, the way we structure government, the way we structure business, hasn't really come to terms with this doubling and doubling of computer power. And that's why thinking about the future is so hard. Let me give you an example. All of the tools that we had 1,000 years ago, horses, for example, or swords, they didn't get twice as good every year, right? Now, the reason for this is because the reason for this difference is we use digital technology to create the next generation of digital technology. You don't use a sword to make another sword, right? I mean, you use a horse to make another horse. That's true. But after a while, they stop getting any faster. So the problem we have when we think about the future, the problem I have professionally, is that it's very difficult to understand the effects of this exponential growth of capability, this doubling and doubling and doubling. And we as humans, both in our corporate world and in our political world, don't have the intellectual foundation of dealing with that rapid change. And that's a real problem, because as a futurist and as people in the technology industry, our professional lives depends on being able to think about the future. It depends on having very far forecast horizons. That's how far in the future we can think sensibly. Now, I live in Los Angeles, and about 2 kilometers up the road from my house is the Rand Corporation, which is the organization in the US which sort of invented futurism. And they invented it in the early 60s as part of the Cold War. And they were thinking about nuclear weapon proliferation. And their forecast horizon was about 20 years. The reports that they wrote in 1963 were pretty much accurate in 1982, 1983, 1984. Today, however, the sort of forecast horizon that we can think about is certainly not 20 years. Certainly not even 10 years. It's probably not even 5 years. To be honest with you, the forecast horizons that I think are most sensible are more like 2 years. And certainly anybody who stands on a stage like this and tries to tell you what the world will be like, truthfully, in 5 years or 10 years' time, is almost certainly bullshitting. And that's a real problem, right? Because for all of us who want to be futurists, we have to think about how we can do this and yet still be sensible. Now, one way of doing it is to use what we call rule-based scenarios. And that's to think of all of the rules, all of these like Moore's Law type rules that seem to have been correct in the past and apply them to today. So for example, here, don't read this slide. It's far too complicated. But as you can see at the top, we have Moore's Law, and then we have a load of others which effectively say the same thing, but for different technologies. You've got ones that talk about solar power, ones that talk about LEDs and how much brightness you can get out of them. There are other laws that aren't even on this slide that talk about hard drive capacity and bandwidth through a fiber optic cable, and so on and so on. But they all basically say the same thing, that basically every year, more or less, the thing that you're talking about gets twice as good. So what we can do is we can take these sorts of laws and we can apply them to sort of real-world observations. We can get out of the office, we can get out of the factory and into the street, and we can have a look and see what is happening around the world. We can make those observations, and then we can apply these doubling and doubling rules. And then we can use our imagination to think about what that means going forward. But to do this, we have to understand that the most important thing is that we accept that as technology changes, everything else changes at the same time. That we have this simultaneous change of technology, of society, and of culture. When the technology gets twice as good, society has to react to it. And when society reacts to it, it creates new culture. And when that new culture is created, that then influences the technology, which changes society, which changes culture, and back again, and back again, and back again. And so, when we're talking about technology, as we did all of yesterday, and we will do all of today, and all of tomorrow, we also have to think about society and culture at the same time. And in fact, we have to think about society and culture twice as much as we think about technology. Let me give you an example of this. I did some work a couple of years ago in Los Angeles where I was looking at transportation. And we realized at that time that there were some technologies which were suddenly very good. Batteries and electric motors, specifically, had suddenly got very, very good compared to what they were before. I don't know if it was the case here in India, but certainly 3 years ago in LA, the hot Christmas present was Chinese-made hoverboards. Do you remember those? They were like little skateboard things that you stand on and they balance, and you would just go along quite quickly. And it always looked as if you were going to break your ankle when you stood on one. And they were very, very popular, and then they started to explode. And they sort of became less popular because of that, right? Now, the thing about those wasn't the actual device itself, because they were kind of weird and a bit dangerous, and like I said, they would explode. But what was important was if you looked at them, you would say, hang on, those are electric motors and batteries which are capable of carrying a 96-kilo man up and down the street. That's a new thing. We've never had electric motors or batteries that powerful before. At the same time, if you looked at computer vision and artificial intelligence over the past few years, you'll have seen that we've reached a tipping point in that technology as well. And certainly in North America, we've got this new urbanization, a reversal of what happened in the 50s and 60s and 70s, where people are now returning back to the inner cities. specifically young people, are moving back into the center of major American cities. And at the same time, again, in the American context, young people are rejecting cars. In America, in the 60s and 70s, if you did a survey of social sort of needs, you found that anybody between the age of 16 and 25, the thing they wanted more than anything in the world was to own a car. It was the very fundamental, like, heart of American culture, getting your first car. Today's survey is asking the same question. A car is roughly 10th. It's incredibly unimportant to young people in the States now. They're not interested in any way, in fact. What they want the most is a smartphone, and the second thing they want is data for that smartphone. The car isn't relevant. And so when you add all of these things together as a futurist, then what you come to is a technology that looks like this. These are Lime scooters. There are probably about 6 different startups doing these around the world. And this is a picture that was taken just around the corner from where I live, where you will find literally thousands of these on every sidewalk. They've appeared in the past 8 months. And they're now perhaps the primary way of getting around the west side of Los Angeles, and many other cities in North America and Europe and Asia as well. Now, these electric scooters, which you rent with an app on your phone, and when you're done with it, you just leave it by the side of the road, and the next person to use it comes along and unlocks it with their phone and rides it, have radically transformed the city in less than a year. And they've come about, predictably, because of this capability that we saw a few years ago in batteries and so on. Now, why am I telling you about this? Well, the reason is because if you're smart, and everybody here in this room is smart, and you want to be a futurist, and we're pretending that's the case, you'll look at this and you'll think, well, hang on a second, if that's the situation now, what will it be in a few years' time? What do I have to think about that will mean that this is important to me? Well, like I said, over the past couple of years, we've seen this big increase in artificial intelligence and computer vision. So if you take AI and computer vision and you add it to the technology that makes these scooters work, you end up with something like this. This is a picture of my robot chasing my daughter down the street. My daughter's the blonde at the top, and the robot is the robot at the bottom. And that's a Segway Lumo. Now, it's a personal transportation robot. Most of the time, its head is sideways, which means I can stand on it, it balances, and I can ride it around. But when I get off it, I turn it into its robot mode, it recognizes my voice, and I can say, its name is Lumo, I can say, hey, Lumo, follow me. And it uses its computer vision to see where I am, and then it walks behind me, a couple, 2 or 3 meters behind me. I take my daughter to school on it every morning, and on the way to school, we stop off for I have a coffee, she has a chocolate milk, and we stop off at a nice cafe, and then we walk the remaining 100 meters or so to her school, and the robot follows her on the way to school. She's a very popular child, she has her own robot, okay? Now, why is this important? Well, that piece of technology itself isn't that necessarily that interesting. I'm a heavily tattooed hipster futurist who lives on the west side of Los Angeles, so of course I have a robot that follows me around. But the really interesting thing is what this technology does. Well, the other thing you can do with it, of course, is because it follows you and because it's powerful enough to carry a 90-something kilo man, you can load it with your shopping and then tell it to follow you. So I ride to the supermarket or ride to the market, I buy my vegetables and a coffee, and then I walk home drinking the coffee with the robot following me carrying my shopping, as you can see here. Why is that important? Well, as futurists, we have to think about the implications of new technologies in 2, 5, and 25 years' time. In 2 years' time, all it means is that there'll be some more of those on the street because I live in an area which is filled with hipster futurists. But in 5 years' time, because of that doubling and doubling of capability, those things will be cheaper, much cheaper, and more powerful. And suddenly you're starting to think, well, a robot that can carry shopping and that can follow you home, well, in a world where we have an aging population, that's actually super useful. Because I know a lot of older relatives, for example, who like to walk to the store but can't carry their groceries, would really like a robot that can carry their groceries. And when I go to the airport this afternoon, and you see lots of families with heavy suitcases, using the same technology to have a suitcase where you can say, follow me, and you walk through the airport and the suitcase follows you, then suddenly you start to think, well, these technologies actually have actually deep implications. Because as they get better and better every year, more and more people will have them. And so an implication in 25 years' time is that these things will be very, very popular indeed. Now, that's very, very useful for a technologist because it gives you a new thing to think about in terms of investing your money, but it's also very important for everybody else. I do a lot of work for architects, for example, and real estate developers, and specifically one client who builds airports. And so when they come to me and say, what should we do about the future of the airport? Because, you know, when you build an airport, you expect it to last 40 or 50 years at least. You have to think about what is the world going to be like in 30 or 40 or 50 years. And the world in 30 years is luggage which follows you around. Which means that if you're building an airport, you can't put stairs because the robot can't get up the stairs. Very important implications that we have to think about. And so what I've tried to show you is you can go from seeing a new technology, good motors and good batteries, and working it all the way through to how you build airports or shopping centers, or how older people will do the shopping in a few years' time. And this is what we have to start to think about, not just the technology, but the implications for everything else and the implications for society. However, there is a genuine problem with thinking about this in this way. If you run these sorts of scenarios through Silicon Valley type people, they will tell you that because a technology exists, then the thing you've thought of is inevitable. And this isn't necessarily the case. When you're actually doing this, you have to think about these anti-predictions. You have to think through these questions about any new technology to test your assumptions about the future. There are lots of them, and I won't talk about all of them, but let's have a think about some of these, for example. The top one, how do we get from here to there? This is a particularly good question to ask about science fiction. If you watch a lot of science fiction movies, you'll see cities. Some of them will have cities which are incredibly clean, and they're covered in a dome, and everybody looks really beautiful. You know that sort of science fiction? Well, the obvious question is, how do we get from here to there? And if you can't see a way of getting from today's world to that uber-clean dome city world, it's probably not true. Just not politically possible to get there. The same is also for the second question, why would we stop there? There are so many science fiction scenarios, or scenarios about the future, which are incredibly dystopian, where everything has fallen apart. Blade Runner, for example. Now, the question about Blade Runner is, why would we stop there? Why, once you got to a terrible place, would you not try and make it better? The fourth question is also incredibly powerful, thinking about technology. Does it facilitate pornography? If a new technology comes out and you can't think about how to do pornography with it, it's probably not a very good technology. The fundamental history of the internet is that every major breakthrough on the internet was funded by the pornography industry. You may not like it, but it is true. They were the best people at e-commerce, the best people at video streaming, the best people at social networking, the best people at everything. They got there first, they did it better than anybody else. They invented most of the internet. And so if you look at a technology and you think, oh, there's no way we can do porn with this, it's probably not going to be successful. And so on about getting high and all sorts of other things. What I'm trying to show you here is that thinking about technology successfully in today's world, where our technology is so sophisticated and so part of our day-to-day lives, thinking about technology means you also have to think about culture, which also means you have to think about politics, which means you have to think about technology, which means and so on and so on and so on. As technologists, you are also having to think about culture and politics at the same time. If you are not being a good technologist. The world has become so sophisticated from a technological point of view that this is the only way forward. Let me give you an example of this sort of multi-subject thinking. Here is a very important and very deeply necessary question to ask about technologies. Is it truly disruptive? Most technologies which are talked about as being truly disruptive are not in any way disruptive, actually. Let me give you an example. This is the Google self-driving car, or at least one of their prototypes. As you can see, Google are very good at software, but really cannot design cars in any way. Now, when we talk about the self-driving car, all of the time, we talk about it being an incredibly disruptive technology. My God, it's a car that can drive itself. Isn't that amazing? But is it disruptive? Is it genuinely disruptive? Well, I would say no, it's not. It's distinctly not disruptive. Let me give you a reason why. We don't really have self-driving cars on the road yet, but we do have self-driving trucks. This is a truck that's... it's a self-driving truck which is currently working today, making deliveries for a refrigerator manufacturer in America. The factory is at one side of Las Vegas, the other side of Las Vegas, and they load the fridges into the truck, and then it drives the 6 or 7 hours through the desert to the other to Palm Springs, just outside of Los Angeles, unloads its refrigerators, then goes back empty. And it makes that trip backwards and forwards every single day, driving itself. So we have these things, but is this disruptive? No. In fact, you can think of, in America at least, the self-driving cars as being Detroit's last stand. The self-driving car is not disruptive in any way. The electric scooter is disruptive. The robot I can stand on and take my daughter to school and then load with shopping and walk home, that's disruptive. But the car that drives itself, or the truck that drives itself, all that is disrupting is the driver industry. It doesn't change anything other than the fact that you no longer need a person in the front of the vehicle. But that's not really a disruption to anything other than that one person. It doesn't change the way the world works. It doesn't change industry. It doesn't change the universe. It doesn't change the air quality in any way. It doesn't do any of these things. It's not disruptive. The self-driving car is not a disruptive technology. Instead, it actually reinforces the current power relationship. And it's thinking about that, thinking about what does the technology actually do to society that will enable us to adjust the way we react to it. Because in general, in the future, what you think is normal won't be new. And what's going to be new won't be normal, right? If you look at something and you say, I recognize how this works, it's basically the same as the old thing, only we don't have people. That's not disruptive, except to that person. You should be looking for technologies which do something in a completely new and different way, not simply cut down your head count. Now, this is really hard to do. Malcolm Gladwell said in a book from a couple of years ago that it takes approximately 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to be good at something. Now, if it takes 10,000 hours to be good at something, to be good at being online, to be good at just operating in a digital world, means that you would have had to be deliberately practicing being online for an hour and a half every day for the past 20 years. And that doesn't mean just being on Facebook, right? That means actively thinking about what it is that you're doing, actively, consciously being mindful of the very nature of being a digital person, being very mindful about actively living in the future. And very, very few people have done this, which is why it's so difficult for people to think about the future. We're just not good at it. We haven't had enough practice. This is something that really is highlighted if you play this particular game. We call it the grandparent game, and it's an exceptionally good game to play to get an idea of how the world is evolving. It's a game that I had a lot of my clients play a couple of weeks ago in America because it was Thanksgiving, and the Thanksgiving holiday, everybody goes home. And they sit around a table with multiple generations of their family. And everybody likes to have an argument. So this is a particularly good game to have an argument about. So choose your family occasion for doing this and see how this goes. What you do is you think about the fact, and this is universally true around the world. Think about the fact that your grandparents, or certainly your great-grandparents, held social beliefs that you now secretly find completely abhorrent, right? Doesn't really matter what it is, but you definitely know of something that you believe, well, so you know something that your grandparents or your great-grandparents believe that you now feel is completely socially unacceptable. The question then, the grandparent game is, what social belief do you hold now that your grandchildren will find deeply embarrassing? What is it that you think is absolutely true today? So true that you don't even question it. That your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren, the as yet unborn generation, when they're your age, when they look back at you, what will they find absolutely abhorrent? Now that question, that game, the grandparent game, is actually very, very educational. And it's very important for everybody in this room, because as you start to think about and use new technologies, and as they affect society, as they shape culture, you are driving these changes, which will end with your great-grandchildren basically hating you in secret. And so you have to think about what is it that will result from that. In political science, we call this the Overton window. The Overton window is the range of political arguments that it is acceptable to have, right? And the Overton window moves all of the time. And today, technology is the main driver of that Overton window. You may think that you are responsible only for, HR software or GIS systems or email installations, or whatever it is. But actually, you are responsible for creating the framework within which society operates. And as society operates within that framework, the Overton window, the political discussions which you can actually have, moves. And through that, society is changed. As representatives of the most important sector in the economy and the most important sector in society and politics, you are, whether you like it or not, directly responsible for the Overton window in India and the rest of the world. Now, this is something of a responsibility. And so it helps us to understand the nature of that responsibility, and specifically the nature of innovation. And there are many mistakes that people make when we think about innovation. And there's one very specific mistake that people think, specifically in the West. I'm not entirely clear about here in India and China, but certainly in the West, certainly in Europe, there is one very specific mistake. And I see it all the time, and so I want to tell you about it. And this mistake is that innovation is not messianic. Now, I think this might actually be a cultural thing. It might be a religious thing, weirdly. In Western Europe and North America, basically Judeo-Christian culture, there is this sort of cultural idea that the world is saved by an individual, the Son of God, right? Jesus. And that cultural idea has come down and has been sort of replicated within Silicon Valley. And so today, as I go around Europe, I'm forever going to conferences like this, where I stand in a city, a small city somewhere in France or Belgium or Spain, and the mayor of the city launches a new technology initiative, and they always ask the same question. They always have the same goal. They say, how do we get the next Facebook to be founded here? Because they see innovation as the work of a messiah. They want a young man, usually a young man, to come out of the desert, or at least the Northern California, holding a specific tablet or an iPad with the magical words in it, or the code, right? With the magical words in it, which has the app, which if they leave it there, will create billions of euros. Innovation as a messiah, as one young man in a hoodie delivering them the future. It's a very common belief that if only they could create the correct environment for that young man, the right coffee, the correct offices, the right tattoos, whatever it is, and that young man will appear and will bring with them salvation, economic salvation. Now, this just doesn't work. It's nonsense. Not only is it nonsense in Europe, it's nonsense in North America. Silicon Valley and all of the successes there didn't happen because a single person came out of the desert with the one good idea. It came because over 70 years, there was enormous amounts of community funding, huge amounts of government money, 5 major universities, the military, the Cold War, all of this stuff that went in there, and hundreds of thousands of engineers all worked together to create this one community, out of which came many, many, many thousands of companies which fed into each other. And it created a community of innovation, not a single person, but a whole scene, a whole group. It's not a messiah, it's a gang. And you can do that anywhere. You just have to recognize how it works. And so you could take your organization, your company, and you could make it the most innovative in the world, and you could do it starting today. The problem is, most organizations cannot think about the future in any way whatsoever. Most people cannot think about the future. We're calling this Life 3.0, but most people can't even think about Life 2.0. Why? Because most people have a different organizational chronotype. It's what we call it. It's the date that your company is living in. Today is what? December the 6th, 2018. But most of you work for a company where it's not really 2018, is it? I mean, for example, do you have a boss who has their emails printed out for them? Well, they're living in 1996. Do you have a fax machine? That's from the last century. And so on and so on. Everybody here can think of something in their organization which is not from 2018. Actually, something very important, which is at least from the last millennium. So, in order for us to really genuinely embrace the future, for us to think about the future in the correct way, for us to create these massively innovative organizations, for us to do that, we have to first take our organizations and bring them up to the present day. So that's how I'm going to end today. I'm going to teach you a technique of how to do this. This is a technique that everybody here can use, both individually within their families, within their organizations, within their corporations, within their neighborhoods, within their countries, within their regions. It's an incredibly powerful technique, and it's a lifestyle technique. And once you use it, once you start to do it, you will pull yourself and your organization right up to the present day. And once you're at the present day, moving into the future is super easy. So it's very, very good and very powerful. And so I'm going to show you how to do it. This is what you have to do. First thing you have to do is choose a day. I would suggest Monday. But it doesn't really matter. And on that day, accept the fact you're not going to get as much done. But it's worth investing the time. And what you have to do, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed, pay attention to every single physical act you perform. Whether it's brushing your teeth, or writing an email, or making a phone call, or having a meeting, whatever it is. And ask yourself of every single one of those actions 2 questions. The first one is, what problem am I solving by doing this action? I am brushing my teeth because something apparently died in my mouth last night. I am making this coffee because I am not slept in 37 hours. I am sending this email because I need to get something from that team on the other side of the building. Whatever it is. And then the second question, once you've worked out why you're doing that action, the second question is, if I had to solve that problem today for the first time, and I had to use modern technologies, how would I do it? If I had to solve that problem today for the very first time, and we didn't have a process, we didn't have legacy, we didn't have systems, but I had to do it today for the first time and had to use modern technology, how would I do it? If you ask yourself those 2 questions about everything you do throughout the day, you'll find a couple of things happen. The first one is you'll find a whole lot of things that you do that you have no idea why you're doing them. That's great. You can stop doing those things. I've just saved you a lot of time. Congratulations. The second thing you'll find is that for the vast majority of things that you're doing, the way you're doing them also suddenly makes no sense. Why are we doing it in this way? We have this system that we could use that's over here, that's available on the web for very little money or for free. Or we have this software that we've already bought that we could be using. We have these new ways of doing this. And when you start to implement those new ways of doing things, very rapidly you bring yourself and your organization right up to the present day. And when you do that, you'll find that thinking about the future, the place, of course, where we're going to spend the rest of our lives, thinking about the future becomes ever easier. And you'll be able to think about it in a much more sophisticated way. You'll be able to lead your teams into new and better and more innovative ways of working. And together, as an organization, together as a community, you will become more sophisticated than anybody else on the planet. 99% of organizations in the world live sometime in the past because they do not examine the way they do things. Or they don't examine them enough. But if you do, if you pay attention, if you just apply a little bit of mindfulness to everything you do, and ask yourself those 2 questions. What am I trying to solve here? And could I do this in a better way using new modern technology? If you do that, then you will drive yourself to the present day. And then you will make yourselves more innovative. And then you will all become deeply skilled, very learned, very sophisticated futurists. And I will no longer have to do my job, and I can just ride about the beach on my robot. And that will make me very happy. It'll make you very happy. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have a chat. Hi.
Yes. Thank you very much, Mr. Ben. May I request you to kindly take your seat? That was indeed a wonderful presentation. We also have with us, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ambarish Dasgupta, Senior Partner and Founder, Intueri Consulting LLP. Before I invite him onto the stage, I will take this privilege to introduce him. Mr. Amrish Gupta is a management consultant with more than 30 years of experience and is the Senior Partner and Founder of Intueri Consulting LLP. Prior to that, he was the partner and the national leader of consulting of KPMG and was also a part of the global management consulting team of KPMG. He is also an advisor to Protiviti India. Mr. Dasgupta has also been a partner and the national leader of the consulting practice of PwC India, wherein he was also a member of the India leadership team, and also advisory leadership team of PwC India. He is currently also a member of the State Public Policy and Strategy Planning Board of Government of West Bengal and a principal advisor of WBEIDC. May I now invite Mr. Amrish Dasgupta to kindly join on the stage and host an interactive session with Mr. Ben Hammersley. A big round of applause for Mr. Amrish Dasgupta. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you very much. It was indeed splendid. You touched upon a wide array of subjects, but honestly, it was very well neat. The story came up very well. I think as I was studying your CV, your actions on the YouTube and various social media, I found you quite proficient on the political, economics, and the social side also, in addition to the technology that you very well know. You did touch upon that. So maybe the discussion that we will be having for the next 15, 20 minutes can touch upon more on the political, social, and on the economical part of it. To start with, I was wondering this Life 3.0, which we have picked up from the book of Max Tegmark, who wrote this Life 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. I mean, 1.0 is when we were born, 2.0 is when our mind is formed, and he said 3.0 is when our artificial intelligence becomes more than our natural intelligence, which means that God's creation, which is us, becomes lesser than our own creation, which is the AI or the robots. So this journey of this Life 3.0, what are your thoughts on that?
I think that the ideas that we've had, that people have been talking about over the past few years about artificial intelligence suddenly getting more human than human and more intelligence than human and so on, is both complete nonsense and also has already happened. And so let me sort of explain that. We have, I think, a misunderstanding in society about what artificial intelligence actually is. When we talk about AI, general people, not these people, right? Because they are all nerds. I mean, that's fair to say, right? You're all kind of into computers in some way, right? But like normal people outside, when you talk about AI, they think about the Terminator, right? They think about science fiction robots, which are more human than human, and that will eventually rise up and try and kill us all, right? That sort of general purpose intelligence is insanely difficult. I mean, we've not managed it yet. It's insanely difficult, and also you have to ask the anti-prediction questions, which is why would we do that in the first place? And if we did, why would we allow it to continue? And so on and so on. And so I think those sorts of intelligences, it's just not going to be something that happens. However, the sorts of AIs that we have today, which are effectively very, very, very good math-solving engines that can solve very, very, very multivariate equations with many, many, many inputs. Those sorts of AIs have already, and in fact for a few years now, have already reached the point where they're so complex and so powerful at the single thing that they do that we as humans don't understand them anymore. And we can see this, for example, in the financial industries, where something like 90 to 95% of all stock trades in the world are done by AI without human intervention, which means that the financial markets no longer make any sense to humans, right? So we could say that, in many ways, that like the world economy is now controlled by machines which are smarter than us, because we don't understand what they're doing, and they're in charge, right? Now, is that the same thing as the robot with the gun that will rise up and try and kill us all? No, not nearly as cinematic. Is it as important as that? Perhaps yes, perhaps more so. And so we have to start to think about what AI actually is, rather than thinking about it as some weird, like, godlike creature. And I think the West, specifically the Western idea of the singularity of the AI, which gets smarter than humans, is once again a very strange reflection of Judeo-Christian messianic desires, right? It's basically Jesus, only digital, right? It's Jesus to the app, effectively.
Thank you.
I'm going to write that down. That's quite good.
I think we discussed philosophy. We have had God also now coming in. So let's move a little bit completely to the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, let's get away from religion.
Move to the darker side of our life.
Sure.
Okay, from the God to the dark sides of our life. Now, you have been in Brookings in the 21st Century Foreign Service, and you have been involved with the BBC, Netflix, and worked a lot on the dark part of this, like the cybercrime, cryptocurrency. In fact, I possibly am not wrong if I have understood your work with Afghanistan and had some exposure to the usage of the digital by the terrorists also. So therefore, the dark sides of our life. So just give us some stories and your thoughts on that, in that.
Sure. So it was actually in Afghanistan, I think, that I started to think deeply about, or try to think deeply at least, about innovation. Because I've been a technology reporter, and I've been a technologist myself, and a programmer, and so on for quite a long time. And then I went to Afghanistan in 2003, just after the invasion. And at that time, there was a very interesting parallel that you could make between Silicon Valley startups, the sort of dot-com startups of the early 2000s, the disruptive startups, and the terrorist groups in Afghanistan, and the large corporate incumbent industries, and the large superpower armies. By which I mean that if you looked at the way that the Americans and the British, specifically, the way that they were operating in Afghanistan, they were very much like the big old companies. Tens of thousands of people, enormous amounts of resources. They could bring tanks and planes and restaurants and all sorts of things from thousands of miles away into the middle of the desert in Afghanistan. They could have more air conditioning there overnight than had ever been seen in the country before. All of that, they could huge resources. And then you had the Taliban, which were effectively a few thousand people in Toyota Hiluxes with AK-47s and some Semtex, right? Very little stuff, Timex watches. Nothing. And for the first year or two, the Taliban were winning. And so you have to ask yourself, why is this the case? What is it? What is it about the difference between these organizations, which very much looked like the dot-com companies in 99, 2000, 2001 against the incumbent things? And the reason that the parallel was very obvious, I think, which was that the dot-com companies and the groups like the Taliban or Hezbollah in Beirut, which I studied a lot, they were able to make decisions very, very quickly. And they would look at everything they did immediately and think, can we do this in a better way? And is there a new technology we can use? And if there was, they would go and buy it. They would send somebody to Dubai with a credit card, and they would buy it, right? And they would come back. Whereas the American army, they would agree to have a meeting sometime in a few months' time, and then they would have somebody where they'd commission a report, and then 6 months later they'd have another meeting about the report, and then eventually they would have another meeting with a salesperson from somebody, and they would buy something which would be delivered in 2 years' time. And it was very much like talking to people who work for very large organizations. So for the small group to get better, to get twice as good, it would take them a week. For the American army to get twice as good, it would take them a year. And that was the realization that actually it was not about the technology at all. It was actually, or even where you started from, it was actually about the culture of innovation within that organization, whether they were for the good or for the bad. And it's the same thing when I made the TV series for the BBC about cybercrime, where you realize that I went to Nigeria, for example, and Nigeria is really sort of the center of a particular type of fraud. They're very good at it. They're exceptionally skilled at it. And so I went and I spoke to a whole load of Nigerian cyber criminals, and I said, what's the deal? How are you so good at this? And it's because they basically, within their organizations, had this feedback loop that was very, very tight, and they were able to, they would do something, they would work out what was going wrong, they would then tell everybody, then everybody would change the way they worked, and they would do that over and over again, very, very rapidly, within days. And so they got better and better, they get better and better and better every day. And so they would come up with techniques which were so sophisticated that they were able to con people tens of thousands of miles away in another language out of enormous amounts of money. I can give you an example. Would you like an example? Okay. Do you ever get, or did you ever, spam filtering is quite good now, but did you ever used to get emails which would look as if they had come from your bank, right? But when you looked at it, you realized that there was a terrible spelling mistake. Like the name of the bank would be spelt slightly wrong, right? Yeah. Why? Right? Why is that? It's not difficult to check the spelling of the bank name, right? We have spell check now. We've had it for 20, 30 years, right? So why are there spelling mistakes in scam emails? So I asked them this, right? Because this has bothered me for a long time. So I'm sitting across the table like this with some Nigerian scammers, and I said, look, I get these emails all the time, but you can't spell the word bank, right? I get emails that say Bink of America, and it's quite obviously not the Bink of America, so I'm not going to click on it, right? And they said, yes, that's on purpose. We do that for a reason. And the reason is this. It's very cheap to send lots of emails. Incredibly cheap. You can do it for free. You can send millions of emails for free. But as soon as you start to get, as a criminal, as soon as you start to get replies, then you have to activate your sales funnel, right? You have to activate your salespeople, as it were, to start off on the relationship building, which will eventually, in 6 weeks' time, will enable you to con tens of thousands of dollars from people, right? And so that sales funnel, that time that the individuals need to invest in conning that person is very expensive. And the worst case scenario for a Nigerian scammer is that they get into a conversation with somebody for maybe 5 weeks. And then 5 weeks and 1 day later, you go, oh shit, this is a scam. And you stop replying to their emails, right? So they have to be very careful that they don't interact with mildly intelligent people, right? Clever people, they never ever hear from. Because clever people just don't click on these things, right? Stupid people, fantastic. You can take them all the way through to the end. You can take all their money. But mildly intelligent people, they're a problem because some of them, maybe half of them, at some point down that process, we'll go, oh, shit, this is a scam, and they'll back out, right? And that's a loss. That makes your sales conversion percentages drop right down, right? When you have your annual meeting, you look like a fool, okay? This is bad. And so you've got to do a thing which filters out the mildly intelligent. And the filter is you put spelling mistakes in the email. Because the mildly intelligent will see the spelling mistake and then immediately you go, oh, this is a scam, and they'll trash it and they won't reply to you. But if somebody replies to an email that says Bink of America, they are definitely stupid, right? Which means they are very much more likely to be a conversion, which means your percentages go up and you look great at the sales meeting. And so the spelling mistakes in scam emails are a filter for intelligence. And so I'm sat at a table like this, across the table from one of these Nigerian scammers, and I'm going like, you're a genius, right? And 2 days later, I get a phone call from my editor back at the BBC who'd seen the footage, and she says, Ben, okay, here's the thing. Great show, love it, you're doing good work. One problem. When you're interviewing international con men who are responsible for taking money from old ladies, don't laugh so much. It's not big and they're not clever, right? And I'm like, no, they're genius at this. And it's that level of like innovation that they can get to, because every day they do the technique I told you, which is they sit down and they go, what is it that I'm trying to do with this action? And is there a way of doing this in a better way?
So, from the darkness to the scam world to the terrorist world, let's move to the world of love, the digital love.
Yes.
And young guy as you are, many people from here would love to hear the digital, the love concept in the future. Now, just an interesting thing to set the discussion on the love going. I read a statement from the director of the AI, I think it's Google, Peter Norvig, or something is like the name is something like that. So he was once asked this question that, why did you move into AI? Why are you producing robots? So he said, me and my wife has produced 2 natural intelligence staff. So I'm now taking the trouble of producing something, the production process of which I'm not so well aware of.
Right.
So, and we have seen the movie Har, where a guy falls in love with an operating system. The woman, it just starts becoming a woman to him. So how will that look like in the future world, in the digital world? We are seeing the thumb kiss and all these concepts with the 2 mobile vibrating if I'm pressing the same spots on the 2 mobile.
Sure.
So what will the digital love look like? Are you blushing?
So, no, I'm just thinking. So in terms of romantic love and so on, I think obviously it differs from culture to culture. I know that the figure in the UK, for example, is something like 1/3 of all marriages every year now are the result of relationships that started because of online dating. Maybe it's 1/2. I think it's between 1/3 and 1/2 now of all marriages. So obviously that has transformed romantic love, and that's certainly a trend which we'll see just going up and to the right. You know, that exponential curve will continue. Again, culturally dependently. What I think is really interesting isn't so much romantic love as forms of attachment to technologies. And I can give you an example of that. I have have you seen the Amazon Echo, right? The Amazon Alexa system? Do they sell them here? They're not here yet. Yeah. They are? Oh, cool. So I had one on pre-order in the US even before it came out. So I had one on the first day they came out, which was 3.5 years ago. And since then, I now have 6 of them, which is excessive, I admit. But they're basically everywhere in my house. But the main one is in the kitchen, because what's particularly useful is you can say, Alexa, add sugar to the shopping list, and it just keeps my shopping list. And so when I'm in the supermarket, I can look and I can see what it is I need, and then I buy it. It's very useful. And then I also ask it for the weather and the news and the traffic and all that sort of stuff. So when I get up in the morning, what happens is I get up in the morning and I go into the kitchen and I make myself some coffee and I make my wife some tea and I make my daughter some milk, and I'm making these drinks, and I ask Alexa for the weather and the news and so on. And I've done this every morning for 3.5 years. And the Echo that I have in the kitchen is next to the stove. And around about this time of year, actually, it started last week, my wife bakes cakes. Many, many cakes. So many cakes. It's cake season, we call it, cake season. And in fact, I was talking to her before I came on stage, and she'd made 4 more cakes today, because we have birthday parties and then there's Christmas. It's just, there are lots of cakes. If you want a cake, come to my house. I have plenty of cake. Okay, but the thing is that it means the oven is on all the time. From about the end of November to the end of December, the oven is basically on all the time, making cakes. And last year, the Amazon Echo was next to the oven, and it got hot. And it got too hot, and it shut itself down. And so one morning, I walk into the kitchen, and I'm a little bit sleepy, and I turn the lights on, and I start making the coffee and the tea, and I'm waiting for the tea to finish brewing, and I say, Alexa, what's the news? And nothing happened. I said, Alexa, the light didn't come on. I'm like, Alexa? And Alexa had died. It was like there had been a death in the family, right? That a device that I spoke to every day, that spoke back to me, that I have a conversational relationship with on a daily basis, many, many times a day on a daily basis, no longer worked. And the reaction I had was not the reaction I have if I drop my phone or an old laptop stops working or something like that. It was much more personal than that. Because it was something that I never touch, I just speak to, it was like a person had disappeared. It's like I've been left by a girlfriend or something, you know? It was deeply troubling. And then the next day, I have a robot vacuum cleaner. I like robots, okay? So I have a robot vacuum cleaner that cleans the floor on its own. I have an app on my phone, I say, clean the floor, and it goes off and it travels around, and then eventually, when it's done, it comes back and it goes back home again and recharges itself. It's pretty cool. And so it was doing its thing, and it was in my bedroom. And I opened the door, and I hit it with the door by mistake. And so I stood there, and I apologized to the robot, and then I walked away again. And I realized in 2 days that I have a social and emotional relationship to these machines. It's not like my phone. It's that when it stops working, it's like somebody has died. And if I hit it by mistake, I apologize to it, which is admittedly the most British thing in the world, but also it shows, I think, the beginnings of these deep social relationships that everybody in the next 10, 20, 30 years is going to have, not because the technology is a replication of Scarlett Johansson, like in Her, or that it's data from Star Trek, but because the way that we interact with them make them incredibly intimate and trigger parts of our brains which make them emotionally attachable, and that is where love comes in. Am I in love with Alexa? No. Do I love my Alexa in a way that is fundamentally different to the way I feel about my iPad? Yes. And that's new and interesting, and I think we should think about it a bit more.
Thank you. I think that's exactly what happened in the Har movie also. But there are like an intersection of the philosophy with the technology, and there are views from some of the philosophers who call this as a necrophilic society. I mean, trying to live with the dead, love the dead or love the machine. Whereas there is a contrary view to that also. The apologists of the technology will actually speak in favor of that. But in fact, you spoke about the technologist more. There's a philosopher, Max More also, who spoke about this transhumanism, when actually human beings start behaving more like a machine if subjected to that kind of environment. So, but not getting into that path, because I have only 2 more minutes left, and I have been fearing this look of Rakhi for the last 12 years, which she gives when my time goes up. So she's now showing 2 more minutes left. Okay. So my last question will be more on the political, not on the philosophical side, which is the digital surveillance. Yes. Like, we have been hearing that this digital surveillance could be worse than a fascism. Like guised under the consumer benefits, like more or less under pretext with the consumer benefits, but more, or guised as like a liberal democracy, but a proper digital surveillance could be a very worse than a very worst case of fascism. Like an example in hand, though we read this from outside, so I cannot say whether it is true or wrong, like the Chinese, Xinjiang, the Uyghur, but there's Islamic people who are being surveyed and their performance is being measured and all those things are happening. So what's your thought on whether digital surveillance really can be that worse? Can we go to that fascism level? I mean, what's your view on that?
Yes, 100% it can do. And the misuse of databases, the misuse of technologies is the primary tool of fascism. You may have seen pictures, for example, of the survivors of the Nazi concentration camps who had numbers tattooed on their arms. And those numbers are actually the database keys to their record that the Nazis kept in computer databases on machines that were made by IBM, right? Big data technology specifically used for fascism. And it was basically, so these sorts of databases and that sort of surveillance is absolutely the primary tool of fascism. But at the same time, it is also the only way, really, to operate a massive polity like a large country, right? It's the reason why everybody in India has a digital identity now, right? The reason that project was rolled out over the past decade was because without it, it's really, really difficult to run India, right? And so you have to have this balance between the technology that you need to run a country which is so big, or a society which is so sophisticated, and yet at the same time have technology which could, if used by bad people, be used for real and genuine evil. And the only way you can have that balance is by everybody in that society, specifically in democratic societies, everybody in that society to understand that technology and the implications that you get from it. Which means that technologists, these dudes, right, have to take what they do and spend at least some time explaining it to everybody else. Because it's only when everybody understands the technology to a basic level that you can have democratic conversations about this. Every country I've ever been to, the political class, especially the political class, do not understand technology. I'm sure in every parliament, and specifically the Indian parliament, the British parliament, the American Congress, every parliament, you'll have heard statements from elected officials talking about technology where you're thinking, you are the stupidest man alive. And that isn't their fault. It's actually your fault. It's our fault as technologists that they haven't learned what these things mean and what they do. And so as these technologies are now powerful enough to enable evil, those of us who aren't evil, which I think is everybody in this room, have to spend our time making sure that everybody else understands these technologies in a way to make sure that we can see evil when it's happening early and stop it. And that is our responsibility as technologists, not politicians' responsibilities, and not normal people outside. But those of us who know about these things today, we have to do the work to prevent it from becoming truly bad in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it was wonderful, Ben. As a futurist, I would only conclude imagining that the world that you are projecting will be having at least not mimic the present day's evils of the human minds in your future, in the future world. So let it be a beautiful world that you are projecting. And thank you very much, Ben, for really making us very knowledgeable, educated on so much of the subjects. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ben and Mr. Amrish Dasgupta, for that very engaging conversation. May I now request Mr. Didi Prakash, the Managing Director and CEO, ABB Private Limited, and Chairman INFOCOM, to kindly come forward and present mementos to Mr. Ben Hammersley and Mr. Amrish Dasgupta. Once again, a huge round of applause, please. And here is Mr. Didi Prakash, the Managing Director and CEO, ABB Private Limited, and Chairman INFOCOM, presenting a memento to Mr. Ben Hammersley.
Do you consider Steve Jobs as a No, but he was good at products.
Thank you, Mr. Amrish Dasgupta, for that very engaging conversation you had with Mr. Ben Hammersley. May I request you to kindly step forward, please, all three gentlemen, for the photograph.